move on here for what do you do with observations, okay? I want to show you how a worldview affects the conclusions reached from observations. Everybody has the same data. I can't see the bottom there. Will this go down slightly more? I bet it will. Oh, there we go. And watch it roll all the way up. How do I get it to stay down now that I touched it? There we go. Sorry about that. Virtually every culture on this planet has stories about a global flood. Just an observational fact. There's hundreds of them that have been documented. So what do you do with that observational fact? Let me see something here. Hang on one second. There's something else I wanted to show you. Hold on just one moment, please. Here it is. Where'd it go? Okay. Okay. So here's some examples of some of the information. Here's one of the Chinese flood stories. And I don't have time to go through all the details of it, but there's a number of aspects that are very interesting. Yeah. The number of people, a man and his wife, their 3 sons. Sounds sort of like the biblical flood account. A big ship, pairs of animals, all that stuff. Look at the names. Noah, Han, Ham. Lo-Shen, Shem. Jahu, and Japheth. There's this phenomenal similarity even in the names. And it's just the point that a lot of the details in many of these flood stories, they're not identical to the Genesis account, but they have a whole bunch of commonality. Very interesting. So that's just an observation. The facts, the raw data are what are facts, okay? It is a fact that all these cultures have these stories. All right? But what do you do with that? Well, depending on my worldview, if I've got worldview Y, I reach this conclusion because that worldview constrains how I interpret the data. Okay? If I have a different worldview, different beliefs and assumptions, I may reach a different conclusion. Don't think this is a fact. Those aren't facts. Those are conclusions. This is a fact up here. So how does this apply to this example? Here's the data. These flood accounts. Lots of similarities, but not identical. And they're all over the planet. There's your data. Materialistic worldview. What do they do with that? Within that worldview, there was no global flood. Okay? Period. So it can't be that the stories represent reality. It's not possible. And so they say, well, the biblical account is just a modification of earlier legends, and it got changed to agree with the author's monotheistic beliefs, no historical basis at all. That's the conclusion. Now, these kind of statements are often presented as facts. They're not facts, they're conclusions. What about this? From a biblical worldview, same data, same facts, other flood stories are distorted versions of the actual event, which, by their similarities, provide remarkable confirmation of the account. Think about this for a moment. Suppose a global flood, as recorded in Genesis, actually happened. By the way, it isn't just Genesis. The New Testament refers to only 8 people surviving the flood. So you can't play the game and say, that's Old Testament, ignore that. The New Testament says it's true. We're going to talk about that Sunday morning, by the way. But suppose it really happened, okay? So you have Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. That's it for humanity, post-flood, okay? Do you think it might be the case that they would tell their kids about the flood? Any chance they would pass that information along? And you think the story might get retold to subsequent generations? And then as people disperse across the earth, you have different cultures developing, different people groups, do you think they might have retold this story? And what happens when people retell a story? Some of the details get changed. Certain elements get added. They retain a lot of commonality, but you get differences. That's how, when stories are retold in various groups, that's what happens. So the truth is, if you started with only the biblical view of the flood, you would predict that observational data. We would expect to find flood stories that have commonality with Genesis but differences. And usually in science, when you can make a prediction from a starting point and then you confirm it, that's about as good as it gets in science for confirming something. That's what you can do with the biblical flood. But I wanted you to understand how much this is influenced by my starting belief system. If I've totally ruled out it might be historical to begin with, I will never reach those conclusions. Okay? And don't mistake this for facts. Those are not facts, they are conclusions. Now, yesterday we looked at one particular petroglyph. I'll show you a picture of that again. This is in the Kachina Bridge National Monument in Utah. Remember this one, for those of you who were yesterday? The one that looks a whole lot like a dinosaur. Looks just like that dinosaur. In fact, it's called Sinclair, even by critics who say that's not a dinosaur petroglyph. What I want to share with you is a scientific rebuttal to the idea that that's a dinosaur. Okay? Most of the time it's just ignored. But because us silly creationists go around showing this to people, some people decide we need to refute that nonsense. And so Phil Center from the Department of Natural Sciences up at Fayetteville State, he and Sally Cole wrote an article. They went and did investigation, wrote an article refuting this nonsense. That is not a dinosaur petroglyph. And I'll show you what they claim. And this article was referenced by the Smithsonian. Okay? So you would think this is actually good scientific investigation, right? I mean, it should be if the Smithsonian is referencing it. So what did they do? Here's what they claimed. In their article, creationists are simply not thorough. Okay? Here's what they said. Dinosaur 1 refers to that one. There's other petroglyphs up there, too, that are interesting. We're only going to talk about one of them. Dinosaur 1 has received considerable attention from young Earth creationists, but close inspection and thorough description of it has not occurred before now. What are they saying? Nobody else has looked at it closely, but we're going to. Isn't that what that says? This lack of research, meaning those silly creationists, is understandable because it's approximately 2 meters above the head of the average observer on a nearly vertical surface surrounded by rough and extremely steep terrain that discourages the carrying of a ladder about an hour by foot from the nearest road. Okay, why would they say that? You'll see. Here is some photos from their article, okay? And they're showing, yeah, we're out here, we're, typical on-site stuff, okay? Here's what they're claiming. Yeah, you think it looks like that, but it's really this. It's a bunch of disjoint pieces, meaningless scribbles that aren't even connected. If you look closely, get up, this is what you really observe. It's not a dinosaur-like petroglyph at all. You just think it is, and you've been misled by those creationists. Okay? So, separate scribbles, not a dinosaur. Look at this. Close inspection and thorough description has not occurred before now. So what was their technique? When you write up a science investigation, anybody who's doing any laboratory science in school, you write up your technique, right? Somebody's supposed to be able to reproduce it. So what do? Examined with the naked eye and with the aid of binoculars and telephoto lenses. They didn't take a ladder. So they were giving you the excuse for why they didn't take a ladder. Okay? Binoculars and telephoto lenses. This is the close examination that's never been done before. Now, decades ago, I saw photographs of creationist investigators up on the ledge, examining it inches away. I remember one in particular, somebody took butcher block paper up there so they could carefully sketch the outline and get the dimensions really accurate. Okay? So the idea, the statement that nobody's observed it closely is a blatant lie, or they're completely ignorant and did no research at all. One of the two. You guys decide what you think is most likely. Okay? So here's what they publish, and the Smithsonian points to it. Here's the rebuttal to it. Well, Vance Nelson, that I mentioned yesterday, great book. Really recommend it if you have an interest in this. He went back. After this was promoted by Smithsonian, he took a colleague and he went back. There he is. He brought a ladder, by the way. Yeah, it's up there. There's Vance. He's up on the ledge, inches away from it. Okay, here's some actual research. And by the way, you can go download this. There's a nice PDF file with all the high-resolution color photos, etc. Interestingly, Center and Cole took only black and white photos. Why in the world nowadays would somebody not take high-resolution color photos? They took low-resolution black and white photos. Go figure. Here's what he wrote. We have examined it, the petroglyph, from literally inches away. The peck marks continue evenly from the body into the tail without a break in the type, depth, erosional features, or patination. That's the patina that's still there. In other words, their claim that there are two separate petroglyphs is patently false. And they've used nice high-resolution pictures to look at. There is no gap, as they claimed. More high-resolution pictures published. Even their own low-resolution black and white photographs show this fact. Either they have been inexcusably careless in their research or they've blatantly lied. That's an inescapable conclusion. Okay? By the way, Vance mentioned it took 25 minutes to carry the ladder there. I can't overemphasize. That seems like a ridiculous example. That when I first started researching this area, I was very uncomfortable with the notion that evolution was false. And so I went and read all the rebuttals I could find to the creationist arguments. And there were some creationist arguments that weren't very good. They did not hold up, okay? But there were many that did. But one thing I found when I started critically questioning these rebuttals to what creationists were presenting, I found a whole lot of stuff like the Center and Cole report, which is pathetic. There's no other area of science where Smithsonian would reference something like that. That is ridiculous from a scientific integrity perspective. It's simply inexcusable. But, and ironically, there's other scientists who don't try to deny that that's a dinosaur petroglyph. They go, of course it is. And we'll tell you how it is those Indians knew what that dinosaur looked like. But yet Smithsonian references that. So my comment to you is, be skeptical. Don't just take these supposed refutations and rebuttals as though they're gospel truth. Most of them are paper thin. And if you challenge them, they collapse instantly. Like that one is just ridiculous. But it's not unusual in terms of the quality of a lot of the rebuttals. The truth is, I've been thinking about what's going on here in the thought process and trying to think back as to how I thought. And I've come upon two different words that I think capture the difference. If I tell you I believe something, and I can either give you, let me reverse it. If I tell you I don't believe somebody's claim that they've disproven something, so I'm an evolutionist, a creationist is saying origin of life couldn't have happened, okay, that kind of thing. I say, well, I don't believe their statement. Well, if I give you reasons for my current belief, reasons are things you can go in, but they're actually evidence. But if I give you some vague statements that don't really hold up very well, those aren't reasons. That's an excuse. Center and Cole's report is an excuse for not admitting that's a dinosaur petroglyph. It's really not good science research. I'm amazed they would publish something like that, to be honest with you. But I believe they're just simply so convinced that their worldview is correct, it just can't be. And they didn't get up there with a ladder and look at it closely. So they saw what they want to see, I guess. So the worldview restricts your conclusions. This is what I was just saying. For Center and Cole, it's just impossible American Indians really saw a sauropod dinosaur. So it can't be. So they just don't see it. And maybe they don't want to look too closely. You think maybe they didn't bring a ladder for other reasons. Maybe they actually brought a ladder, got up closely, looked at it, and said, I don't like this, put it away, and took distant photos. I don't know. I don't want to believe they would have done that. But why anybody would go to investigate something and not bring a ladder, why would you bother to drive out there? It just doesn't make any sense to me. And as I mentioned, this refutation is similar in accuracy to an awful lot of refutations of creationist research. Now, Adrienne Mayer, we have another researcher, okay? She flat out admits American Indians, for some reason, had intimate knowledge of dinosaurs. They knew what they looked like, they knew their proportions, they could draw them accurately, and they knew where they were. That's a really interesting perspective. They knew where they were. They actually took some of the American Indian legends, and based upon where they said certain creatures were, they went and looked and found fossil dinosaurs of the correct type. She documents all this. Okay? So Center and Cole obviously didn't read Adrienne Mayer's work or disagree with her. I don't know which. She doesn't deny the visible evidence. And she admits these stories match real dinosaurs. And as I mentioned, they find even the correct fossils. So, what does she conclude? How did this happen? We know darn good and well Indians didn't see dinosaurs, right? That's not possible. They were extinct 65 million years ago. Of course, so was the Coelacanth, but we won't worry about that, okay? They found, here's what she says. These Indians found fossils. They extracted them from the solid rock. They accurately reconstruct the skeletons of dinosaurs. In other words, they do what our paleontologists do today at the American Museum of Natural History. So they did all this work to accurately create the skeletons of full-blown dinosaurs, not partial ones, full-blown dinosaurs. And then they figured out what the fleshed-out creatures would have looked like. Some of this are implications of what she said. Some of it she said explicitly, but it's unavoidable. Then they made up stories about encounters with them because the Indian legends are specific. I mean, they hunted the creatures. They had techniques for hunting them. There's all these stories about all these interactions. It's not just they existed, here's what they look like. There's a bunch of stories about interactions with them. Well, those didn't happen, so they made them up. So they made up stories about interacting with them. Now, American Indians, they pass along their whole history as oral stories. And they're experts at remembering oral histories. Okay, remember we talked about that yesterday? So basically you're saying these guys made up a false history and then told their offspring that it was true. So they pass it down as their actual history. And then this one's really interesting. And then apparently they hid all the evidence that they ever did any of this. Because there's absolutely no physical evidence or historical ideas that they ever did this. So this is centered, Adrienne Mayer's explanation. Remember Carl Sagan's explanation? He said our pre-human memories from millions of years ago of encounters with dinosaurs were dredged up as terrifying dreams that were so vivid that people thought they saw them. That was Carl Sagan's explanation. Adrienne Mayer's explanation is American Indians were the world's best paleontologists and then told lies to their people and then hid all the evidence of ever having done it. That's what it boils down to. Those are the only two explanations I know of out there. If anybody knows of any other explanation for why we have these very accurate representations of dinosaurs and their dragons, per Carl Sagan and others, that's being redefined now. If anybody comes across any other supposed explanations, please let me know. Go to my website and post a link to it. I know of no others, but I'm looking for them. Okay? I want to find them. To me, if I'm a skeptical person and I'm not completely tied into a materialistic worldview, I look at these explanations and go, something's wrong here. I mean, you got to have a really firm commitment to materialism to ignore this. Now, here's something else, just as a another piece of ancillary information. It's really hard to reconstruct dinosaurs from fossils. Okay? This is Megalosaurus, as scientists thought it looked early on. That's a reconstruction of Megalosaurus. They then found more fossil bones. Very often, these are all very fragmentary. I mean, we don't have complete skeletons. Often we have a very small percentage of the total sets of bones, and the rest of it is made up. And then we may find more later, and what's often happens, they figure out, oh, we did it wrong. Y'all heard of Brontosaurus? Do you know Brontosaurus never existed? That was a mistake. They took the head of one dinosaur, put it on the body of another, and thought it was a new species. Figured out their mistake later. That's what science does. And now they usually call it Apatosaurus. But there is no such thing as Brontosaurus. It's just a mistake in reconstruction. It's hard to do this because you have fragmentary data. So there's Megalosaurus at one point. Here it is later. That's quite a change. Here's what we now think it looked like. Very different. But the American Indians got it right all the time. So they were really good paleontologists. Is that, you have to ask yourself, is that a believable explanation for this? That's the question for any skeptical person. Now, it gets worse. Let's think a little more about it. And this is Mayer herself admitting this. Traditional Navajos avoided all contact with corpses and, quote, places where the spirits of the dead may be. Funeral practices also help explain why all kinds of bones are avoided. The dead were not deeply buried in the ground but left in the desert, which means that any bones one encounters might belong to ancestors or monsters. Since it's hard to distinguish animal bone fragments from human, it seems best to steer clear of any skeletal remains. So Indians are afraid of bones, based sort of on their pagan beliefs, okay? But they're also super-duper paleontologists. Do those two thoughts work well together? You decide. And there's, as I mentioned, there's no physical evidence at all for them having done any of these paleontological exercises. But the worldview takes precedence over logic. That's the bottom line, okay? It's just the way it is. That's just human nature. I know some people that are Bible believers who have serious misconceptions about science. And often they have misunderstandings about what the Bible says too. But they have serious misconceptions, and they don't want to hear anything. They don't want you to talk to them. They think they got a worldview, they got a belief system, and they stay locked into that. And they don't want to hear evidence, any other way. That's just human nature. So it's not that there's something wrong with them. It's that we need to decide, is materialism, does it really work? And I mentioned Carl Sagan's, his response earlier, these inherited memories from our pre-human ancestors. I just don't encounter anybody trying to point to this as a real answer anymore, but it's out there. Yeah, there's no mechanism for inheriting memories like this. Nothing known. And this is also interesting. Something else that, in critical thinking, if you want to decide if certain statements are true, think about what they imply. If I have two different statements and they're both true, and I combine them and they, if A and B are both true and I work them together and they imply C, C has to be true. If it's not true and I correctly implied them, then one of these is false. That's logic. That's what you're learning in geometry. You can disprove axioms by reaching conclusions, properly reaching conclusions, which are actually false. That's a technique. It's called contrapositive, or proof by negation. It's a mathematical and logic technique to disprove something. So it's absolutely valid to look at what are the implications of a belief. Are the implications themselves believable? Well, think about Carl Sagan's. You have to answer, why did these dreams of these dinosaur encounters all seem to show up all over the planet, because every culture has these memories of dragons, at about the same time, over the same few centuries? I mean, remember, mankind is millions of years old. You get 1 million years or so of modern man. And it was only within 300 or 400 or 500 years, or maybe 1,000 years out of that total time, that these stories about dragons show up, okay? So how did they all show up after being dormant? Boom, they pop into existence. That one's not so bad, but try this one. Why'd they stop? When's the last time you heard somebody say, I saw Tyrannosaurus Rex down at the corner? Why did these dreams stop happening if they're impinged in our DNA and we have night terrors and they're so vivid we think they're real? Anybody heard anybody having dreams? I mean, maybe, I guess, if you were watching Jurassic Park and doing drugs at the same time. But you guys, why did they stop? Why did they start? Why did they stop? I mean, for his theory to be valid, does anybody really want to defend this hypothesis as an explanation? I don't know anybody who really tries to use this. I point it out only because Carl Sagan was so held in esteem among the atheist community. And somebody as knowledgeable and as well-known as Carl Sagan, this was his explanation. Yeah, the world's smartest atheist. I showed you Vance Nelson's book the other day. Here's another book that's a tremendous resource. Dragons or Dinosaurs by Derek Isaacs. This one goes into detail about Adrian Mayer's work. Vance Nelson did not. Let's move on here. Intelligent design. I mentioned Romans earlier about people being without excuse. That's what this is about. Romans claims, the Apostle Paul claimed, there's evidence within the creation for the Creator. Is it true? Any of you hear of biomimicry? It's a new field of study, if you will. We recognize and look for design in living things, for design solutions to problems. Aerodynamic problems in flight, problems in underwater locomotion, all kinds of areas. They're saying we find incredible solutions in living things, and they actually call it biomimicry, or biomimetics is another word. So we're looking for design solutions. This really sort of started with Velcro. You guys know how Velcro was invented? Some goofy engineer guy, he noticed these burrs that were really hard to get out of his dog's fur. So what does a geeky engineer, scientist type do? It's obvious, right? He takes the burrs and some fur and puts them under a microscope. He looks closely and he sees why they're so darn hard to remove. These little tiny hooks and barbs and stuff. And he designed Velcro from them. That's where that came from. It's usually pointed to as the first instance of biomimicry in design of a product. But don't forget, life itself is not designed. Okay? So we look for design solutions for engineering problems, but we also insist life is not designed. Richard Dawkins, again, the blind watchmaker, he said, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And then he goes on and tells you why they're not designed. But he admits they give that appearance. Okay? This is an interesting statement. He was questioned about this idea of, could there be evidence for a real intelligent designer of life? And here's what he said. Well, it could be that at some time earlier, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved, probably by some kind of Darwinian means, to a very, very high level of technology. We're talking about aliens now, somewhere else in the universe, and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. So aliens evolved, became very technological capable, designed life, and seeded the earth with it. Okay? This is Richard Dawkins. By the way, Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for the co-discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule, he also believed this. It's called directed panspermia. And he said, I suppose it's possible you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer. And actually we do. When you look in those areas of study, you definitely find the signature of a designer. And if you try to explain life without it, like Francis Crick did, he was an avowed atheist, spent his career trying to explain how life was created chemically, couldn't do it, so he said, it must have happened elsewhere. And life came from aliens. That's becoming a common belief out there in culture. Really interesting. A lot of people refer to that. And I want to show you, let's see how much time I got left here. I've got a video that's I'm going to show you this on one aspect of intelligent design that's a well-known example. So I think I've got this all prepped and ready to go. I hope I have sound. I plugged this in up here. I guess we'll find out real fast. And they're one of the preliminary examples for evidence of design was something called a bacterial flagellum. And it's the tail on a bacteria cell that it uses to swim itself around. Okay? Michael Behe, a biochemist at Lehigh, wrote about the bacterial flagellum back 15 years ago at least now. So here's an update as we continue to learn more about it, about that subject.
We talked previously about the now famous lowly bacteria and its flagellum. And yes, you'd think it wouldn't be possible to flog this fossil equine even farther, but yes, it is possible. Another paper came out this past week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, revealing even more astonishing irreducible complexity of the bacteria's tail. Many bacteria swim around by...
We've obviously got a buzz in the audio. Is it still, can you hear it well enough that it's worth playing? Okay, sorry about that.
Spinning their tail, called a flagellum. Now, it's very much an inboard-outboard motor with a complex driving motor and sometimes even a transmission which drives the tails when it has more than one. Now, they can spin these tails at up to 100,000 RPM, propelling the bacteria forward at speeds of up to 15 body lengths per second. They are blazingly fast. The lowly bacteria flagellum has become an icon among the intelligent design and young Earth creation communities, starting with Dr. Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, which featured the flagellum prominently as excellent evidence for intelligent design. Now, of course, I agree. If you find an electric motor, you would say it had an intelligent designer, a creator. You would say even more so if that motor was even more complex in that it had the ability to find and process its own energy, fix itself, and make other motors just like itself. It all screams of an intelligent designer. Michael Behe coined the phrase irreducibly complex, showing a rat trap as an example. Now, you cannot remove any one of the pieces of the rat trap without it not working. The flagellum also has a number of crucial parts: the rotor, the stator, the bushing or bearing, the drive shaft, the hook, which is like a universal joint, and finally, the tail. So, which came first, the rotor or the stator? Well, the correct answer is that they both came around at the same time. The rotor is useless without the stator, and the stator is a piece of useless decoration without the rotor, drive shaft, and bushing. The flagellum is irreducibly complex, and thus, like the rat trap, demands a designer who intricately designed the first one. What is also necessary, but you never see, is the complex control systems which speed up, slow down, or reverse the motor. Now, those control systems are also necessary and add to the irreducible complexity of the system. Now, our best minds on planet Earth cannot make a nanomotor that even comes close to comparing to the bacterial motor. Certainly not as fast, nor as small, nor as efficient. Our man-made motors are certainly not capable of finding and processing their own energy sources for power and self-repair, and are certainly not capable of reproduction. But of course, the bacteria are not born with these tails. They must grow them, assembling them one molecule at a time. Now, how is this done? In a series of must-see videos, the Japanese Protonic Nanomachine Project show how the assembly is done, one molecule at a time. Not only is the motor irreducibly complex, there are multiple parts you will never see that are also crucial. as they are crucial to the assembly of the flagellum. Now, this assembly sequence was the focal point of the new PNAS paper, which affirmed what the Japanese team was saying, but now with more detail. It turns out numerous parts of the motor serve multiple functions in the assembly of the system. Now, think about it this way. If you are going to assemble an electric motor, you got to start somewhere. Usually one would start with the bearing and build the motor by adding parts to the bearing. As Jun Liu and team showed in the PNAS paper, the bacteria starts by building what are commonly referred to as the M and S rings. And these two rings then act as a construction platform for what is about to be built. After building the C ring and the L and P rings centering around the M and S ring platform, the bacteria then builds the drive shaft. But this drive shaft also has a dual purpose. It's a hollow tube which acts as the conduit for all the parts for the tail. A five-pronged cap composed of 5 different molecules gets constructed, and this cap then guides the assembly of the drive shaft. Each protein in the assembly gets sent up the middle of the tubular tail. Now, it knows when the drive shaft is long enough and stops making it. A different cap is sent up the center of the drive shaft because it will now use different protein assemblies to build the hook. These proteins to assemble the new cap jettison the old cap, and the hook is assembled one protein molecule at a time, in a similar fashion to the drive shaft. It knows when the hook is long enough, stops building the hook, and that cap is jettisoned by new proteins coming up the tube, which act as locking proteins to hold the end of the hook together. These new proteins jettison the cap. Proteins to assemble a new cap are sent up the middle of the tube, and that cap then controls the construction of the tail one molecule at a time. Now, these caps have 5 legs, and when a protein gets glued into place, the chemical reaction attracts one of the legs. This leaves a gap between 2 of the legs. The protein coming up through the middle of the tube gets guided into place by that gap and glued into place. Now, the next leg gets attracted by that chemical process, leaving a gap for the next protein to get guided into place right beside the previous one. And thus, a tube of proteins is built, one protein molecule at a time. The bacteria knows when to stop construction of the tail and locks the end of the assembly. Now, 2 things I want to focus on here, both of which were the focus of the PNAS paper. One is the seen, the other is the unseen. What is seen is the various parts that are temporary, yet necessary in order to form the flagellum system. If a gene for any of those caps is missing, the bacteria cannot grow a tail, it can't swim, it starves and dies. Also necessary is the specific assembly order and how many parts serve 2 purposes. One purpose during the assembly of the system, and a second purpose while the system is being used as the drivetrain that it is. The system is irreducibly complex. The second thing, which is the unseen portion of the system, is the instructions. How does the bacteria know when to stop sending certain proteins and when to start sending certain proteins? The sequence of what protein gets sent when and where is crucial. If any one of those steps is out of turn, the whole system collapses. 11 years ago, Illustra Films put out a fantastic video called Unlocking the Mystery of Life,
That is
in
very
which they
good.
discussed the bacterial flagellum and its irreducible complexity. In that video, Scott Minnick actually mentioned the irreducible complexity of the assembly instructions for the system. Now, those instructions were pretty much unknown at the time and are still pretty much unknown now, even in light of this new paper by Liu et al. Now, this brings us back to creation. Design demand a designer. Instructions demand an instructor. I love the way spoken word performance artist Phil Long put it in a poignant satire. All Earth's creatures now trace their beginning to the moment when software built its own computer. The exact same thing here. Everything about the flagellum screams of an astonishing intelligence. The irreducibly complex motor and tail system. Its assembly sequence. The instructions on how to build it. The control system that turns it on and off once it's built, and the external energy systems found elsewhere in the cell, which are needed to power the system, so the cell can swim around to find food to process and power the system. This entire system is so complex that the combined efforts of all our most brilliant minds on planet Earth are struggling just to reverse engineer it. It all speaks not just of an intelligent designer, but a designer of astonishing intelligence, supernatural intelligence. That creator was none other than Jesus Christ, who spoke miracles into existence in front of thousands of eyewitnesses, many of them hostile unbelievers. Notice that when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he didn't go and perform CPR on him. Clear. No, he did exactly what he did at creation. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." He spoke the miracle into existence. Do you realize what Jesus had to do in order to raise a man who had been dead for 4 days? Countless cells would have disintegrated. That had to be reversed. Brain cells irreparably destroyed, but the Creator knows exactly how to rebuild the cells he designed. Jesus was supernaturally intelligent. He obviously knew something we didn't, seeing as how he did something our most brilliant minds on earth cannot do today. Raise someone from the dead who's been there for 4 days. But when we look at creation, we see that Creator did exactly the same thing at creation. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." As he did with Lazarus, he spoke life into existence. And why is it that people believe in the miracles documented by the apostles, miracles that happened right then and there, instantaneously, and yet they struggle to believe that God could have created life just as fast? I mean all due respect, but these same people absolutely cannot believe that creation happened only 6,000 years ago. It had to have taken God billions of years to produce life. Well, I assure you, rebuilding dead cells in Lazarus' body is just as complicated as building them from scratch. And it didn't take Jesus billions of years to do it. Jesus then died and rose from the dead himself 3 days later after being murdered at the hands of professional killers. He rose from the dead to show us that he was the victor over death and the way to eternal life.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. That's Ian Juby, a full-time creationist researcher. I mean, that's all he does. I don't think he's married. I can't imagine a wife putting up with what he does. He travels all over Canada and North America doing stuff. But the claim would be he's anti-science. Okay? And yet what he's showing is a very latest report from the scientific community about what we're learning about life. There's no anti-science component here. He's not a materialist, and he doesn't try to force a materialist conclusion onto what science is learning. In no way is he anti-science. In no way am I anti-science. But that claim is very often made. Just understand what it really means is, fact, it's often stated this way: I no longer have enough faith to be an evolutionist. I know too much about the scientific problems, and I don't have enough faith to accept a materialist solution when I know too much about those problems. But that would mean I'm challenging a materialist faith. So just understand, anti-science really means anti-materialism. That's what it really means. Anyhow, the type of design that we're seeing here, the level of complexity, is what we're learning rapidly in biological research. Molecular biology is just exploding with information. He mentioned one last thing, and then we'll break for this morning's session. And if we have some questions for now, we'll take a few questions, and then we'll have this afternoon session and questions at the end of that as well. But he mentioned in passing the control system. It's one thing to talk about the molecules floating around. If I have time, I'm going to show you another video that's only about 4 minutes long this afternoon that shows what goes on in a cell in reading DNA and producing proteins, the primary thing that a cell does. Okay? You just get a glimpse of what's going on there, and you'll see particles just showing up. Just like here, the correct molecules are showing up and being in a very controlled way assembled. All right? We don't have a clue where the control mechanism is that is orchestrating this. I keep asking scientists. Nobody knows how this is orchestrated, nor do we know where the information is. There's evidence that it's not even in the DNA, that it's elsewhere in the cell. So how this is being done, it's one thing to observe it. It's another to explain it. And our observations are becoming very, very impressive, very interesting stuff. I highly recommend anybody with an interest in science dive into what we're learning. One last comment for this morning. There is no reason at all for a knowledgeable, let me leave the word knowledgeable out, let me phrase it this way. There's no reason for any Christian to fear what science is learning. Absolutely no reason. We just need to learn and pay enough attention to what they're learning. It does not contradict a biblical worldview at all. In fact, it's more and more providing confirmation of the severe difficulties in trying to ignore the biblical worldview and still explain what we observe. There's nothing to fear there. So that's a real message for you. The more you know, the less there is to fear, to be honest with you. So enough for today. Any questions for this morning? Yes? Okay. Now you say within species, so what I refer to as microevolution? Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. So do I. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, one comment on that, because that comes up a lot. My wife and I both do teaching, and the way the body of Christ is described in the New Testament in particular is you have different members with different abilities and talents and different jobs to do. Okay? So in no way does it mean that every single Christian should go get a PhD in molecular biology so they can talk to an atheist biologist. That's not what. But within the Christian community, within the body of Christ, there are PhD molecular biologists fully equipped to have that discussion. And those resources are available to us. And that's where we support each other. I would do a really horrible job of trying to counsel somebody with marriage problems. In fact, my wife would laugh at that idea. The only thing I could contribute would be, here's some things I've done that were absolutely a bad idea. That's it. But that's not my role within the body of Christ. So don't feel like what the message here is, you have to go learn all this stuff. No. Just be aware there's resources available. be like the Bereans, search the Scripture. But understand one thing. You don't need to be intimidated by the claims like what Indiana University tells their undergraduates. Those are not true claims, that there's nobody who questions this. Those are falsehoods. Okay? So just understand that and don't be intimidated. Now, from a biblical worldview, should I be surprised that there is deception out there in the world, and deception that specifically moves people away from a belief in the Bible and in the God of the Bible? From a biblical perspective, should I be surprised by that? Absolutely not. We're told that is going on and will go on. We're told about it. So there's no reason to be surprised by it. We should expect that there will be false statements out there. There always have been. The biblical view of the deceiver, Satan, his tactic is deception. Jesus said he's a liar, he's the father of lies, and when he's lying, he's speaking his native language. So we should expect there to be lies out there in culture that specifically target belief in God. I mean, it just goes with the territory. So we should not be surprised, but don't be intimidated either. Just know there are resources available. I mean, I assemble lots of stuff. There's certain areas where I have some fairly good in-depth knowledge. There's a lot of areas where I don't have super in-depth knowledge, but I know who does. I know which, and I pay attention, so I can perform this one little role in the church, but other people have other roles. So just know there's resources available and no need to be intimidated by it. Okay? I hope that's helpful. I think I saw somebody else. Any other questions this morning? Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, go to Creation, Myth, or Miracle, all one word, creationmythormiracle.com. And there's a number of things there. I do have a list of links to a bunch of resources where if you followed the links I have, there's probably tens of thousands of articles. Certainly many thousands of science-related articles based on those links. And I also have a growing number of blogs of my own highlighting specific things, kind of like what I'm showing you here. This presentation, I've done this before, but I've added new stuff that I've recently learned doing a radio show that I'm doing. So on my blog, I've got a growing set of info, some of which is very, it's stuff just in the news today. And my 25-minute recordings are available on the website also. That's one little resource, but my links point to a lot of others. And any questions, suggestions, objections, you're an idiot, those are fine. I'm serious. I'm truly serious. I want to hear the objections. I may be wrong about something. That's not outside the realm of possibility. Okay? I've been wrong before. I want to know it. If I'm wrong about something, I want to correct it. That's just plain, I'm not infallible by no creationist is infallible, but also no evolutionist is infallible. So we ought to be challenging stuff. So I truly welcome skeptical input. And I'm looking for good skeptical input because I probably have a lot of stuff to learn. And I was a skeptic, and I considered myself a reasonable, intelligent, science-based skeptic. So I don't have any problem with that worldview. I mean, I'm not antagonistic toward it or anything. I enjoy talking to people who have reasons for what they believe and are passionate about it. But post something. I've got one blog specifically just for people to post stuff. And it's brand new, so there's only a few pieces of feedback so far because I've just started it. But also you can send me email at richard@creationmythormiracle.com. So feel free to do that as well. Right. 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 Correct. Correct. Absolutely. That's absolutely. this afternoon, that's a good point. They are separate discussions. Very good point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't mean to imply evidence for design is not evidence for young Earth, not directly, okay? This afternoon we're going to talk about some stuff which is absolute direct evidence for the short time span from science. But they can be separate subjects. Michael Behe is not a young Earth creationist, okay? Paul Nelson is. He's a member of the intelligent design community, a PhD biologist. I mean, it varies. So that is a separate subject. You mentioned something else, though, how it's easy to follow. At the layman's level, it makes sense. One word I've seen is it's convincing. You know who said it's convincing? The evolutionists who are making sure that information is not presented in public schools. They admit it's convincing, so we do not want the public to see it. And it's because it's convincing. Okay? Make sure they're not aware of this stuff till they already have a PhD and are fully committed to that. Go ahead and, like I showed you, it's okay to use lies to gain their trust and get them convinced that evolution's true, and then later on we can hold their hands, and then when they encounter them later, then they'll be able to deal with it. That's kind of the idea. Yeah. Correct. Right. Without. Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. And so that's where this afternoon session is really important. We're going to look at some recent finds that directly impinge upon how old are things and how do we determine the age of things. There's plenty of evidence there, too. I haven't presented any of that yet, other than one thing. The evidence that humans knew what dinosaurs looked like. That has severe implications on the time scale. Okay? So, but you're right, they are separate, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I don't mean to confuse the two at all. Thank you. Yes? Shall we break for lunch? Everybody tired of listening to me? All right, thank you.